Hi Ian, welcome.
Hi, Kelly.
Hiya. As I said earlier, if you do have any questions, please do post them in the chat. But if for any reason you really can't post in the chat, I'm happy for you to raise a hand, and I'll do my best to try and spot you. And you'll be welcome to unmute and
Can
ask
I
questions
could
then.
I kick off while we're waiting for that first question, Kelly, by
Sure
offering some
thing.
constructive disagreement with what Fabrice has just said? So I think there's a bit of a common misconception that's really important here that he's perhaps guilty of having adopted there, which is it's not about translating or transferring the transport mobility we already have away from roads onto other modes. We will not get anywhere meeting our carbon reduction targets unless we travel less altogether. So the example I always use here is that everybody thinks that the Netherlands is a fantastic example where cycling is ubiquitous and it represents something like a quarter of all transport. But the carbon emissions for the transport sector in the Netherlands are higher than here because they have more of everything. So they cycle more, they use public transport more, and they drive more because their entire society is based on even more mobility than ours. And so it's just not true that by swapping from car travel to other modes, we'll get to where we need to be. We actually have to travel less. And that has to be the overriding objective of any transport policy which is focused on emissions reduction.
Super, thanks Ian. So we have our first question in. I'm hoping there'll be lots more. But the first question is, why not a charge on cyclists rather than car users all the time?
So why would we charge cyclists?
Yeah.
We charge people to use the roads infrastructure on the basis of how much space they take up, i.e. congestion, and how much damage they do to the roads, how much physical material and labour we have to put back in to maintain them. So if you look at how much of either of those things a cyclist uses up, consumes in comparison with a car driver, or remember a heavy goods vehicle, and particularly in the case of roads maintenance, it's a factor of 1,000th or a 10,000th, or probably smaller in terms of the space and particularly the damage to the infrastructure that a cycle does in comparison with a road vehicle. So that's simply why. The costs that a cycle journey imposes on the rest of us are almost infinitesimally small.
Thanks. We have another question, but this one's around heavy industry and farming. So the question is, if you can answer it, heavy industry and farming are not expected to cut emissions as much as other sectors in current plan. Why is that? Aren't these the worst offenders? Question mark.
Well, I'll stick by trying to answer that from a transport perspective, which is that transport's the sector which has been stubbornly decarbonising the least, just about. And we don't, I think as Kevin alluded to a moment ago, we don't really have a credible pathway in policy terms to outlining exactly how we're going to get to net zero in transport. We know theoretically what we need to do, and that's all about travelling less and then having private road transport as a much smaller proportion of the physical travel that's left after that. But because it's so politically difficult to say to people, sorry, you're going to have to use your cars a lot less, we don't have yet a pathway in terms of policies with milestones and dates on them in terms of how we get there.
Yeah. Okay, there's a comment that's come in that says the space for cyclists is taking up a lot of the roads and making new cycleways. But I'll read out another question.
As a proportion of the overall road space we have, that's absolutely tiny, the amount of space that we dedicate to cyclists, absolutely tiny. And the public health benefits from more active travel, walking and cycling, or something else that you'd have to put into that kind of equation when you think about what return you get on investment. There's lots and lots of work in the transport sector, probably more than any other area of the economy, about trying to calculate what the costs and benefits of every pound of public money spent on the different modes or different kinds of projects are. So there's lots of really detailed information about that out there if Assembly members would like me to show them where to find that. Far too much to try and cover in a quick answer like this, though.
Yeah, I feel like people are warming up now. More questions are coming in. And someone else has just made another comment about cycling, that cyclists already pay for roads in tax, equals its vehicle tax that cars pay. Okay, I'll move on to the next question, which is, can routes not be made more direct, i.e. if traveling by bus, it takes me approximately 2 hours to reach my destination as opposed to 30 minutes by car. Bus routes are very indirect. Any thoughts there, Ian?
Oh, yes, of course they could. The problem with buses in particular, the way that we've organised them, is so that it's not just about the fact that they're commercial services, most of them. So bus companies run them to generate as much money as they can, but that does tend to mean that the objective of bus routes is to pick up as many people as you can on a service and not necessarily get you from point A to point B as quickly as possible. So what a lot of our public transport is trying to do is serve lots of different needs and different kinds of groups who don't always want the same thing. So particularly in the UK, the people from the overall population that use the buses tend to be people on lower incomes. They tend to be key workers. They tend to live in particular kinds of places and work in particular kinds of places. So over time, services have evolved to suit that segment of the population, but not others as well as you might think. So that's one of the biggest problems we've got, for example, in trying to swap car travel into bus travel, is that journey times are too long. So I mean, that's absolutely correct. To do something about that, you need to change the management of the bus system quite significantly, invest a lot of money in, first of all, more capacity, so more buses, because we don't have any spare really at the moment. But probably more importantly is reallocating road space away from cars to buses, because our average bus journey times are really slow because of congestion. And that congestion is caused by private cars mostly.
Thanks, Ian. We've got quite a few coming in now, so I'll take them in batches. And the first one here is, why do cars have priority? In Germany, if you're cycling or walking, you have priority at a road junction. And then there's another one here around aviation. That's, what, in your opinion, can be done to reduce flying as aviation emissions wasn't mentioned?
So on the priority issue, I think there is actually a consultation out from the UK Department for Transport that holds the responsibility for the Highway Code about changing our urban road hierarchy to make it come into line with the European norm, where cyclists and pedestrians always have priority at junctions. So I mean, there are little things that can be done, but that's a cultural issue. So in the UK, our kind of post-war conceptualization about what post-war recovery and modernisation was all about motorisation, and we tried to adopt the same kind of very pro car policies that the US and some other countries had. And so the best known example of that, of course, is why we ripped out the tram systems in most of the cities across the UK, because they were seen as being old-fashioned technology and inflexible, and we had to reallocate the space that they took away to private cars. I'm sure any of you who've been lucky enough to travel to some of the cities in the continent where they avoided that era will realise how different they are, and that the culture of travel and transport in cities, mostly across German-speaking Europe, is really, really different, as was suggested there. In terms of aviation's a curious sector. It's quite lightly regulated economically. Hardly any tax is paid on aviation fuel, of course, so that's why it is possible, or it was possible pre-COVID, for people to travel around on low-cost airlines across Europe so cheaply, because the fuel costs very little relatively. And it's been one of those sort of feel-good growth sectors in the economy. So again, Fabrice was, I think, talking about some of the political difficulties of intervening to change things. It's a really brave politician pre-COVID who would say, I'm sorry, we're going to make it harder for you to buy a ticket on EasyJet or Ryanair this weekend and go away and travel. And, you know, look behind me and look at the number of travel guides that I've got. I'm one of these people who loves the opportunities of travel. I've done a lot of it across Europe by train, not necessarily by flying. And it's really difficult to say to people who perhaps couldn't afford to fly until very recently that they can't do that anymore. So that's one of the really difficult trade-offs, I think, that politicians have not really come up with an answer to, which is how they progress, or even in terms of aviation, make some really small steps to becoming more sustainable, but make sure that people have the opportunity to travel, particularly people on lower incomes.
Thanks, Ian. Okay, next couple of questions. So the first one is there any possibility of resurrecting intercity freight train usage to reduce motorway truck usage?
Yes, and interestingly, that's already happening to some extent. So you can have a look at some of the statistics about very recent growth in freight, particularly in Scotland, and that is happening. But in terms of overall demand and carbon emissions, it's still quite niche.
There we go. Thanks, Ian. And then the next one is, what percentage of public funds is currently assigned to public transport, and how much for cycling and walking? What should be spent? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, it's partly that depends on how you count it. And the biggest difficulty there in trying to assign those numbers accurately is to work out the money spent on local roads and streets and how you allocate that between different users, because actually, you know, of the 20% of all trips that are by walking. We tend to make most of those in our local neighbourhoods. So there's all kinds of assumptions you have to make there about what local roads are for. But having said that, it's true that we do still spend the majority of our money on roads, but then they currently make up something like 2/3, 3/4 of all motorised travel demand. So there's a long-term effect here that we've created an economy really dependent on road vehicles. And that's why we spend the amount of money we do on roads. Again, where I'd disagree a little bit with Fabrice, I think, is that the Irish example, their new coalition government that was elected this time last year, has a Green Minister of Transport, so their 20% target figure is very new. And in Ireland, they've spent the last 20 years investing huge amounts of money in their trunk road and motorway network to try and bring it up to standard, because until about 1990, they effectively didn't have any modern long distance roads. And their railway network is still very slow and very underinvested. So what any particular country spends on transport today doesn't just reflect the political or environmental priorities that we've got in 2021, but it reflects what the priorities have been for the long term, because transport policies take so long to develop, and the projects in terms of new infrastructure that we build take so long to deliver. A lot of the choices we've got today were made a long time ago, and that's partly why it's so difficult now to change our priorities quickly to reflect decarbonisation as our overriding objective. What should those relative figures be? Well, that's probably the thorniest question of all. Within the public transport sector, I'd point you to the fact that we spend vastly more money on railways rather than buses, despite the fact that a fraction of the number of people travel by train as do bus. So again, that reflects who it is that travels and why by railways. And they tend to be people who are better off travelling to work and more likely to vote.
Thanks, Ian. So we've only got about 1 minute left, and I'm going to ask this question because I noticed it come up yesterday too. And it's, when can we expect to see hydrogen buses as opposed to old diesel? And also any thoughts? Oh, sorry. And just to wrap into that, any thoughts you might have around subsidies for public transport?
Well, again, we're already seeing some Scottish bus companies buying these vehicles. There was a major announcement from McGill's, which is one of the larger operators in the west of Scotland, buying some electric and some hydrogen buses. Just this week, I think it was on Friday, it was announced. So you'll see that begin to happen, but without very significant additional public money. A private bus company isn't going to replace a vehicle that's got a perfectly serviceable life of 5-10 years left. The fleets have to be replaced in order to be economically sensible from an operator's perspective. So there's a whole complex set of issues in there about how much public money we're able and willing to invest, and also how the government interprets state aid rules has been a bit difficult in terms of some of the subsidy schemes that we've seen already. And I've forgotten, Kelly, what the second or the final question was.
Hydrogen buses and the
hydrogen. Yeah, so you'll see that happening more and more. How quickly the take up is will depend partly on the amount of public money we're prepared to invest, but also how quickly demand for public transport travel recovers after the pandemic, actually.
Super. There's a couple more questions, but we are at time now, and we're going to go into our breakout rooms just to digest some of what we've heard and have a discussion as a group and think about what this all might mean for the goals and the recommendations that you've been developing. But I just want to say huge thank you, Ian. Thanks so much for getting through so many of those questions in quite a short amount of time. Really appreciate it. Anything you'd like to say just to end?
No, I think I'm going to do the rounds now of the carousel, aren't I? So if there are some questions I can see in the chat that we weren't able to get through in the plenary session, more than happy to follow up on those in the groups to come.
Good stuff. Great. Well, you'll all be seeing Ian later, but you'll be going into your breakout rooms now, and we'll see you back here in just under 20 minutes.